Hello, and thank you for joining us for this event, Women's History Month Samurai Women, which forms part of the public programme for the special exhibition here at the British Museum Samurai, which is open until the 4th of May. I'm Dr. Rosina Buckland. I'm lead curator on the special exhibition, and I'm delighted to introduce two speakers for the event this evening. We will have two presentations followed by a discussion between the two speakers, and then a period of time for questions and answers from the audience, and we look forward to hearing your questions. I'd like to introduce our two distinguished speakers this evening. First, we will have Professor Anne Walthall, is Professor Emerita of Japanese History at the University of California, Irvine. Her work focuses on early modern Japan and its transformation in the 19th century. She began with studies of peasant uprisings, then peasant women, and most recently religious studies with the publication In the Presence of Gods and Spirits, Hirota Atsutane and His Collaborators, which was published last year. She has also explored women who served the shogun in addition to other topics such as masculinity and guns. And then secondly, we will have Professor Sabine Frühstück, who is Distinguished Professor and the Koichi Takashima Chair in Japanese Cultural Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Professor Frühstück studies modern and contemporary Japanese culture and its relation to other parts of the world, enjoys building synergies, rethinks the conventions of scholarly work, and probes national and cultural boundaries. And her recent books include Gender and Sexuality in Modern Japan from 2022, Playing War of 2017, and Uneasy Warriors of 2007. So we're very privileged to have these two speakers. We're going to start off with the presentation from Professor Walthall. So I'd like to hand over the floor to her, please.
Thank you, Rosina, and thank you all for inviting me to do this. I think it's going to be fun. I've been looking forward to this now for some time, and I've got a few things I want to talk about. I'll be talking about samurai women, mainly, first of all, giving some general principles regarding the lives that they were expected to lead or might lead, and then I will end with a look at what happens at the very end of the early modern period, the Tokugawa period, looking at what happens in Aizu. But I want to start with this layout of the Seisei family house in Kagoshima. Kagoshima is way down in southern Kyushu, and the Seisei family were rural samurai. That is, they didn't live in the castle town. They lived out in the countryside, and in fact, they had to do some agriculture themselves. But what this house does, I think, is exemplify the principle of sex segregation. I want to emphasize that. I also want to emphasize filial piety. I want to talk about arranged marriages, and finally talk about opportunities and expectations in terms of literacy and culture. Now, if you look at this slide, you can see that there's a south veranda. Next to the south veranda is the front entrance, and then there's a side entrance. The front entrance was used by men. If a man came to the house, and especially if he was an important guest, he would step up into the entryway between the front entrance and the lower sitting room. The family might come to the edge of the hall to greet him, but mainly men would meet him, take him through the antechamber to the upper sitting room. Important guests would sit with their backs to the west, facing the antechamber and the lower sitting room. Women were expected to remain in the back part of the house. They would use the side entrance. They would use the family room. To a certain extent, they might use the hall, but they also had the interior sitting room, which was where people would sleep, a storage room, and of course, they would spend a good deal of time in the kitchen. But sex segregation was considered very important. All samurai houses, as much as possible, were divided between the outer rooms for the men and the inner rooms for the women. Women were expected to stay inside to the extent that the family's economy accepted that, permitted that. If there was a festival going on in the street, they might go as far as the house gate and peer out, but they weren't expected or encouraged to join the festival. They stayed in the inner quarters. The chief duty of a samurai wife was filial piety, that is, service not to her parents, but to her in-laws. And what this meant is that when she married, she would spend most of her time with her mother-in-law, and she would take care of her father-in-law too, to the extent that she had to, if her husband wasn't there. In many samurai families, the husband would often spend months, if not years, away from home, serving his lord, either in the domain headquarters or in Edo, where the shogun lived, what is now Tokyo. And so she would be responsible for making sure that the household was run properly and that the old people were well taken care of. She also, in order to attain this position of wife, she would have an arranged marriage. And what this meant was her parents and her husband's parent, or her to-be husband's parents, would arrange the marriage between themselves. They would have to get permission from the domain. Families did not enter into marriage contracts without domain approval. And she would often meet her husband for the first time. Sometimes they would have an engagement party, but generally speaking, she would meet her husband for the first time when she married him. She showed up at his house, having been carried there perhaps in a palanquin, or perhaps having walked if the family couldn't afford a palanquin. But families had to get permission so that there wasn't any fear on the part of the authorities that they were using a marriage to, say, collude against the regime. So she gets arranged marriage, she goes in, she meets her husband. She might, get a good look at him for the first time in the interior sitting room, which is where the beds would be taken out at night. Now, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. In all of these houses, you see these two spears. These would be above the main entrance. The top spear is for the husband, and the shorter spear is for the wife. The idea behind these implements is if an enemy came to the house, then either the husband or the wife would be prepared to defend it. Sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. But the idea was that even a woman, even if she was a samurai, was expected to know how to use a spear. In this case, this is a straight spear, a yari, but oftentimes they had a curve at the top and were called a naginata. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, now, in addition to learning how to bear arms, samurai women, to the extent that their family could afford it, were also expected to be skilled in various arts. These are just a few of the arts. This is taken from a game that actually young girls would play, showing the kinds of skills that they might learn before they went into service or before they got married. In the upper right-hand corner, you have makeup, what you do to your face, with that broad brush at the bottom is to make sure you have nice red lips, and you would fix your eyebrows, and you would also, of course, be painting your face with completely white. The next slide on the upper left is the practice of haikai. This is one of the many kinds of poetry that women, would be encouraged to learn. They could learn haikai, which is the 757 syllables, or they could learn waka, which would go to 31 syllables. These are short poetry forms, and they require more than just knowing how to write. They also require a knowledge of how the poems are expected to be put together. In the lower right, we have the martial arts that women would practice. And here you see stretching across the image the naginata, which has a curve at the top. Another one of the things that women might learn is ikebana, the tea, flower arranging. They might also learn tea ceremony, depending again on the skill of the family. They would, of course, learn sewing, which I didn't bother putting in here because every woman learned sewing in this period because clothing had to be taken apart before being washed and then sewn back together after it was washed. Women's work. And the next slide then shows, if I can have the next slide, please. There we go. This shows women defending their house. This is a picture from the late 19th century illustrating a text about the 47 loyal retainers who in the early 18th century decided to defend their lord's honor, and because he had been deemed a traitor to the shogunate, this was a little tricky. What they were doing here, however, is they were defending the house when a strange man appears. And so the wife, who is there at the bottom, and her maid, as you can see, are prepared with their spears to defend the house when the husband isn't home. Actually, if you see this play performed in a kabuki theater, the wife is not very effective. But the idea is there that she would defend her household. And this is why women were always trained in how to use the long spear, oftentimes taller than she was. But it happens that women at one point do end up trying to defend their households. So if I could move to the last slide, next to the last slide. Yes, here we go. This is from a different domain. This is no longer in southern Kyushu. We're now northeast of Tokyo, or Edo at the time. In 1868, the imperial armies marched on the shogun's armies, and the one domain that really stood up for the shogun was Aizu. And so ultimately, Aizu bears the brunt of the attack by the imperial forces. And men and women and boys, young boys in their teens, mobilized to defend the domain. Now, actually, women had three choices. Some of them realized what was coming, and in one case at least, the wife took the family heir and went off into a village where they had friends and hid for the duration of the fight. Other women went into the castle to help defend it. There was one woman, Yamamoto Yai, whose father had been an expert in gunnery. She knew how to fire a musket. Her brother had been killed earlier in a battle against the imperial forces. She picks up his armor. She picks up his guns. She goes into the castle to try to help defend the castle, feeling that she was embodying her brother's spirit. Unfortunately, when she gets to the castle, the men there say that she cannot appear on the ramparts with her guns because they didn't want the enemy to feel that they were so weak that they needed women to defend them, that this would dishonor their lord to have to be defended by a woman. Other women in the castle did things like tend to the wounded, cook the meals, and try to put out the exploding shells that the enemy was throwing toward the castle. That was one of the things they did. That's two of the things. A third one is what this woman did. She and her mother and her sister took their spears, the naginata there, and went to defend one of the approaches to Aizu at the foot of a bridge. Once again, the men who were already there said, no, if you fight with us, it will be shameful. What will the enemy think that we need women to defend us? But they were insistent, they stayed there, and this woman was killed by a bullet, and she was the only casualty. Her sister cut off her head so the enemy couldn't take it, and the sister and the mother carried the head back home and buried it. Body they had to leave. The final thing that women did, if I could have the last slide, please. Women who, for one reason or another, couldn't escape the city, when their husbands and brothers and sons went into the castle, said, "You go in, don't worry about us. We'll be fine." And while the men were in the castle, they committed suicide. And in this case, this was a family of a high-ranking attendant to the Lord, and 21 people, women in this household, committed suicide. That's why this marker says 21 people. When the man, as it turned out, none of the men who went into the castle died. And after the war, so when they leave the castle, when the castle finally surrenders, they go out and discover that their women folk have all died, including the aged mother who was being well taken care of, but down to a girl of about 2 years old. They were not allowed to bury the dead because they were enemies of the court. And so instead, the the head of the household, erected this tiny little monument to them and covered it with a wooden shed. It's very hard to get a picture of it, I will say that. But and it was only later after the battles were over and the Buddhist priests in the area collected the bodies and buried them in unmarked graves that the dead were then cleared away from Aizu. But that's what happened to women. They had choices, and they made choices depending on what they felt, what felt their circumstances. But the most important thing to them was to retain their honor. So that's all I really have to say, and I'm within my time.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. It's wonderful to see how it relates to content of the exhibition as well, and some of those roles that you described during the Edo period, but also that the resistance forces up in Aizu. We have a book in the exhibition that talks about the teenage boys and the girls' troop that went out to fight. I'd like to pass over now to Professor Frühstück for her presentation. So please.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I'm very pleased to be here. Let me first establish that women in today's Japan are, of course, much more likely to look like this one, borrowing style elements from manga or anime figures rather than the Japanese tradition, let alone samurai culture that Anne just described. But I would love to first take you through the transition from the martial culture of samurai to the modern military. And I will do so by showing you two postcards, both of which were produced and issued after the Russo-Japanese War that ended in 1905. I believe that these show the dramatic transition from a decentralized military regime, which you see here, to a mixed constitutional and absolute monarchy, which was, of course, marked by a modern mass army. During the time I would like to focus on for the first bit of my presentation, this modern mass army, of course, relied now not on a class, but on, in principle at least, although not in actuality, on any young man who was found fit for military service. So there are lots of different legal changes that determine which men were drafted, which men were recruited into Japan's many wars between the 1870s and 1945. Increasingly more of those men were in fact drafted, but all of them had to report for conscription examination at the age of 20 in order to be recruited into the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. Where did that leave women? I'm going to jump fast forward here into the 20th century. During this whole period, women were increasingly hailed as mothers and wives. And when I would even go as far as to say that the idea of biological mothers being inherently the most suitable caretakers of children is to some degree a modern invention. So when we think today about mothers being at home and taking care of children and the household exclusively, we think of that as traditional, but it's not traditional at all in Japanese historical terms. That is this kind of motherhood, this kind of womanhood is idealized and increasingly lived, or at least aspired to, by Japanese women. Now, during the war, and this is of course particularly true during the Asia-Pacific War, of which you see an image here, women were charged with attending to the home front, with the exception of nurses and comfort women. In modern Japan, women were never formally drafted into the armed forces, even though a law came into effect in 1945 that would have made that formally, legally possible had that war continued. Instead, women were supposed to take care of the children, take care of home front matters, potentially defend the home front, and work in ammunition factories and do lots of similar kinds of things. Now, let me jump fast forward, still staying within the question of the armed forces, into the present. After 1945, of course, the armed forces were dismantled. And then at the beginning of the 1950s, during the Korean War and under US pressure, the self-defense forces, that's the contemporary Japanese armed forces, were founded. From the start, women were recruited into the armed forces as nurses, and then gradually more and more positions and roles and ranks became open to women. Today, female service members make up to almost 9% of the Japanese armed forces. What you see here is military recruitment materials. All of these are from our current moment, that range from the decidedly civilian look of public servants that you see on the left, and the notion that a member of the military is indeed a public servant is often repeated in slogans and in the particular visual aesthetic, to female sexualized fantasy figures borrowed from popular culture that you see on these recruitment posters in the middle and on the right. One thing that is important here, and I think very specific to Japan, is that slogans rarely reference the nation state. They rarely even say Japan. They are much more likely to address individuals who wish, as the image in the center here says, to become a person able to protect someone. So it's very interesting, I believe, that in contemporary Japan, military recruitment materials in a society that is known for somewhat putting less emphasis on individuality than some other societies, targets the individual, the growth of the individual ability, individual talent, and marginalizes the notion of the nation of defense of Japan. Gender inequality in recruitment and promotion practices remains a problem. Some critics today actually speak of a reverse discrimination, namely that the armed forces would rather recruit lower ability men than women. Now, the problem of gender inequality is, of course, not a new problem, nor restricted to the self-defense forces. Let me go back 100 years to the beginning of the 20th century. The beginning of the 20th century is not the beginning of fight for equal rights for women, but I feature here two of the most prominent early feminists who took vocal stances on the subject of gender inequality. The first one here is Hiratsuka Raicho, a champion of women's rights, a proponent of eugenics, who had this to say about women's assigned role as a manager of a household. I have this on my laptop, on my desktop to remind myself. She said, because it is such an unsuitable environment for spiritual focus and the realization of dormant genius, I loathe all the irritations that go with housework. So such a timeless kind of articulation. The second one is Yosono Akiko. Yosono Akiko was a very different kind of woman. She was a very, very well-known and very, very successful poet who gave birth 13 times. 11 of her children survived into adulthood. So she really knew what she was talking about when she railed against the indifference men demonstrated at the sight of women's pain in her experience. Men, I curse them all. They bear no children. Do not risk their lives. How free they are. Of course, such radical voices at the beginning of the 20th century triggered significant anxiety in wider society about such new women. They were referred to as new women then, resulting, for instance, in the production of postcards that were issued and distributed at various events, like this one who shows a wife scolding her husband for coming home late, or this one who features a wife lying on her tatami, reading a book, smoking a cigarette while her husband struggles with cooking, taking the laundry in, taking care of the baby. Or this one that features a woman in Western garb, clearly indicating that she was a modern woman of her time, playing the piano while her husband attends to the baby. Or this one, another poor husband who cleans the floor, baby strapped on his back, while the woman leisurely plays with her puppy. Now, women like these that I just showed you on these images did not achieve equal rights or even the right to vote during the time they were most invested and fighting hardest for it. But that took until 1946 when the new constitution was implemented and had two articles, namely 14 and 24, that now prohibited the discrimination based on sex and gender, and that prescribed marriage as something that would be based on the agreement of both partners. And so, of course, that's a radical difference to what Anne described about samurai women being mostly married off in arranged marriages. That said, in the 1980s, what happens is that more and more women decide that they're not going to have children. And it's in the 1980s when we have the first discussion about the birth rate being alarmingly, shrinking alarmingly, and becoming lower and lower. And so I want to emphasize here that since then, perhaps the story of world historical significance in terms of women and gender is the dramatic shift from attempting to control the number of pregnancies and birth up to, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, to the increasingly desperate attempts to convince women today to have babies at all. Today, that means, of course, that the new category of very old age is the number one women's problem. Both the population of caretakers and the cared for population are now overwhelmingly female. Now, why is that? The most cited reason for the situation is that women refuse to have babies is, in fact, the continuing gender inequality that manifests in a whole lot of different ways. The role expectations of mothers, the high cost of child education, the limited availability of nurseries and afternoon care facilities. But last, but not least, the limited contributions of men to housework and child-raising duties. Now, you do have celebrity fathers like these two men that many of you are probably familiar with, particularly the gentleman on the left, celebrity fathers who profess to take their roles as fathers seriously. There's a large majority of the Japanese population, men and women, who support men taking childcare leave. Childcare leave in Japan is very generous. But time use studies show that a large majority of men either don't help or don't help enough with household chores and child rearing. Now, on other fronts, there are progressive signals throughout Japan in various corners of societies. I give you one example here. Kamikawa Aya is Japan's first openly transgender politician in the Setagaya district in Tokyo. She's been in office for more than 2 decades. And this, despite the fact that the national government continues to prohibit marriage equality, it stands that a range of courts have increasingly declared unconstitutional. At the same time, those seeking to be legally recognized as a person of the opposite sex have been required to have full reconstructive surgery, which courts are also increasingly declaring unconstitutional. So there have been definite signs of not just marriage equality, but other kinds of sexual and gender equality across the social structure of Japan. One might, and some observers do, consider the fact that Japan's current prime minister is a woman as the most unexpected and dramatic signal, not just for Japan's political and financial and economic future, but also signal for women in Japan. Takaichi Sanae is Japan's first female prime minister, and you know that there are very few female leaders in the democratic world. She's often described as feminist conservative. She demands, to speak to the feminist side, that more women ought to be advanced into leadership roles. And yet, she's against marriage equality. She's against women keeping their family names after marriage, a big contentious issue in Japan. And to return to the martial culture that we started out with today, she advocates the expansion of military and the security apparatus in Japan. She's also, since we're speaking partly at least to an audience in the UK, often referred to as Japan's Iron Lady. It remains to be seen whether her feminist articulations or her conservative will win out in the years to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Frühstück. That was fascinating. A wonderful summation that brings us right up to the present day, and wonderful images from the 20th century, those postcards particularly. I hadn't seen most of those. Very surprising to see such provocative imagery from early in the 20th century. Cartoons, the sort of cartoons that you still might see today. I'd like to move on to the next part of tonight's wonderful program, which is to invite you both to engage in a discussion. You have questions for each other, and I think Professor Frühstück is going to kick things off.
Yes, I would love to ask you, Anne. You speak about filial piety in terms that seem very different to today's Japanese society, but also probably to all of us today. How did filial piety really work in a specific case?
Okay, well, I can give a number of examples of that. For one thing, if you look at TOSA, for example, where your colleague Luke Roberts has done a lot of work on Samurai Diaries, he talks about how when the guy he's most interested in, whose name escapes me right now, leaves and goes off to Edo for, the lords had to go to Edo for 2 years at a time almost. His wife stayed at home and took care of everybody. There are other cases. One that I'm very fond of is the story of Tadano Makuzu, who is a famous actually a feminist before her time writer from the early 19th century, who when she had to go through an arranged marriage. Her father was high up in the shogunate bureaucracy, and the first time he married her off to an old man, and she goes to his house, and she just can't stand him. So she cries and cries and cries and cries, and finally she's sent back home. But then she has to be married, and he finds her another man who is from the Mito domain, which is not that far from Edo, from Tokyo. And she agrees, he's more age appropriate, and she agrees to marry him. But it turns out that his mother is back in Mito. And so soon after she marries him, she is sent back to Mito to take care of his family. And she goes. She complains that this was the road to hell. It was a fate worse than death, but she goes because that's her job, is to take care of the old folks. There's another story I can tell about how the guy I just wrote this book about, Hirata Atsutane, he marries. He gets adopted so he can get married, and actually he and his wife fell in love. Before the marriage before them is arranged, and that was quite scandalous if it had been known. But at one point, the family is, even though they're samurai, they don't have a very large income, and they're having children. So he decides to take his young daughter, about 3 years old, and go off into the Edo to make a living as a doctor, and he leaves his wife with the adoptive father, who he barely knew, to take care of the father while he goes off and tries to earn some money. So yeah, the women, that's how filial piety could work out.
I have to ask you, of course, what you must have come across female figures who just didn't do what they were supposed to do.
Well, there are some who ended up not being married right at the end of the period of the Tokugawa period in Kyoto. There were some high-ranking women who were able to figure out a way to live on their own and write poetry. And one woman became famous as a potter and wrote scratched poetry into the lips of her teacups and her pots, and became very famous, and they sold quite well. So there were a few women who managed to figure out ways to live on their own, but that didn't usually happen. One problem, that if a woman stepped out of line and had an affair, that would end up very badly. There's an example of, there's a famous story that was made into a kabuki puppet play, and then into a movie. The movie is called Night Drum, Yoru no Tsutsumi. It's from the 1950s, but it's a true story of a woman in Tottori whose husband has gone off, to Edo with the Lord while he's on doing his tour of duty with the shogun at the shogunate, and she's left behind to watch over the children. At this point, there aren't any older members of the family at home, but she's trying to get his son ahead by putting him in service to a drum master, so that he can learn how to play the drum, because the Lord was fond of drumming, And if the young boy shows himself an expert at the drum, maybe he would get promoted, which is always a good thing for the family. It's very hard to make a living on the amount of money that the domain doled out. So she arranges for the drum master to come to the house and teach the boy how to play the drum. And at some point, the drum master makes a pass at her, and she's afraid that somebody has seen it, and that could get her into trouble. And she tries to get him to promise silence by actually going ahead with it. Very strange idea she had here. Well, of course, that doesn't keep her from being gossiped about. And when her husband comes home, he discovers that, yes, everybody's talking about how his wife had an affair with a drum teacher. It's not a very classy position. And so she is ultimately forced to commit suicide because she has brought shame upon the family by, being the subject of scandal. But the man and his sister and his wife's sister, then go after the drum teacher. They get official permission for a vendetta. You could do this back in those days. If somebody had wronged you, you would go to the authorities and say, I have to, honor demands that I do something about this. And so they have a permission. They go after the guy. They find him in Kyoto, and they kill the drum teacher. But usually what would happen if a woman was caught having an affair, because, again, arranged marriages don't always work out all that well. It's easy for a man to have a concubine or to go off to the brothels. It's not so easy for a woman to find any kind of satisfaction if the husband is indifferent to her or the family is not working out. But in those cases, if a samurai woman has an affair, and there's a woman who's worked on Okayama and found a whole list of these, if both partners are caught, then both are killed. But oftentimes the man has run off and only the woman is killed or is forced to commit suicide.
Interesting.
So that's
shocking.
Yeah. No, I know, but it's an honor system, and there are many countries around the world where the family honor is more important than anything else.
Since you led us so nicely from sex and romance to death, I have to ask you about one other element of your presentation, and that is about this woman cutting off, I think it was her sister's head.
Wait, when she was killed. Yeah.
Yeah. Are we to imagine that samurai women were actually told as part of their martial training that if a situation like this arises, they're supposed to cut their family member's head off and make sure that the head gets to be buried properly?
Well, but this wasn't just for women. This was samurai. The samurai culture altogether says that if if your lord, if your family member, whoever, if you're with somebody who is killed or even wounded, you don't want the head to fall into the hands of the enemy. Because going back, way back into Japanese history, when there was a battle, the way a samurai would try to get ahead would be, or to prove his valor, was to take the head of the enemy and bring it to the commanding officer, and the commanding officer would like to count the heads, see how many heads were, if he got, if he got more heads than he had to give up, then obviously he won. When Hideyoshi sent the Japanese to Korea in the in 1582 to in 1588, there were too many heads to bring back, so they just brought back the ears. And in Kyoto, near the shrine to the Toyotomi, there is a mound where there used to be a mound where the Korean ears were buried. Now, I think they've been returned to Korea, or something's been returned to Korea anyway. But no, it was very, 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 it was part of samurai culture that if somebody dies on the battlefield, if possible, you take the head so the enemy can't get it. And this, by the way, is not unique to Japan. I went to a museum once in Peru where they had I saw some wonderful cups from the Inca era of heads that had been cut off during a fight and brought back to the commander. And of course, he didn't want to keep the head, so he got a cup made it look like them instead. I mean, how else do you know that you've defeated the enemy?
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, is it my turn to ask you some questions? Or
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay, well, I was mainly interested, since we were talking about the military, you had wonderful images of Hirata Araicho and Yosana Akiko. I'm very fond of both of them. I think they have very important things to say about family and housework. Yeah. Anyway, but I was curious about women who go into the self-defense force. What kind of women do that? I mean, is it I mean, in the samurai era and in the Tokugawa era, it was the elite women who knew how to fight with a spear. Is that true today? And how does families feel about women going there? How does a family feel about their daughter going into the self-defense force?
Thank you. That's obviously a crucial question. There's some degree of overlap with men who go into the self-defense forces, but not a whole lot. Women who join the self-defense forces today usually go via two routes. Either they attend the military academy and then become officers, or they go after high school. And in both cases, the primary motivator is economics. So a lot of these women believe that they would have a much better professional career, no matter whether they go in as enlisted or as officers eventually, than they would have in their civilian lives, because they don't have the socioeconomic means to have a university education. So economics is a driver. Typically, families are not happy about their daughters going into the military. They're worried about their safety. They're worried about their marriageability. Women themselves, typically, in addition to their educational aspirations, they also want to prove their independence. And they are to some degree driven by a feminist impulse, because they imagine with their low level of education they would otherwise achieve. They would only have low level of white collar work open to them, and thus be relatively marginalized in the labor market. Whereas they imagine the military as a truly meritocratic institution in which they could have a real career as officers.
And so do they have real careers as officers?
Yes, so many of them do. Many of them among the 9% that they make as a population within the military, there are very high-ranking officers in all branches of the service now. They tend to be, if they're married, they tend to be married to other self-defense forces members. So it's very unusual for an officer in the military to be married to a civilian man. And that all has to do with equality of careers and how careers are taken seriously, but it also has to do with their frequent posting in a different place. So it's obviously difficult to have a husband who might also have a career, let alone have children.
On the other hand, there are countless examples in Japan today of women whose husbands are sent overseas for years at a time, and it makes it difficult for them to have a career in Japan if they have a special skill that they were hoping to develop.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
does the military then make an effort to ensure that if there is a married couple and they're sent, one of them is sent abroad, say, that the other one will go too?
Yes, the military does make an effort. It even makes an effort, although this is not openly said, but I've heard it from service members that same-sex couples sometimes get posted to the same place.
So the military is much more enlightened than the rest of society, I think one could say.
At least in legal terms. So this is informal, right? Nobody
Uh-huh.
says out loud, hooray, I have a same-sex partner, and can you please make sure we're posted to the same place? They just apply for their posting, right? They have three, first, second, third wish where they would like to go. And often their first wish is granted. And that sometimes happens to be in the same place as their partners.
I think that's really so. In fact, it's the military is very different, say, from the business world, where if you get married, especially you have children, then you're often sidelined in terms of any kind of advancement possibilities.
That's correct.
I'm surprised that more women aren't in the military then. But maybe they don't know about this opportunity.
Thank you very much. I think I didn't know about some of these details of the proportions and the possibilities and the accommodations that are being made. It's fascinating. We're going to move now into the question and answer session, and we've had a few questions coming in from the audience. I'd like to start off by directing one to Professor Walthall about literacy, differences between samurai women and those of lower classes, aside from being taught literacy and martial practices. Were there significant differences?
In terms of cultural attainments or just generally overall?
Generally, I think significant differences aside from what you mentioned of literacy and martial practices. What are the real differences in lived experience, I suppose?
Lived experience. Well, I would say that the main difference is in lived, well, they were, first of all, as I say, in samurai households, you have sex segregation. You've got half of the houses for men, half of the houses for women, and women were expected to stay indoors to the extent possible. And for farm women or townswomen, they had much more freedom of movement. They had, well, in some cases, in the townsman's house, their shop would be at the front, and the man would be in charge of the front of the shop. But if he's not there, the woman would have to take over. Whereas that would certainly not happen in a samurai house. Women would, let me organize my thoughts here for a minute. Women, if there was a festival, women participated in festivals if they were commoners. They did not participate in festivals if they were samurai. If a samurai woman went out, she had to have a servant with her. To a certain extent, that was true of commoner women, but not. But again, if they needed to go out, they would go out. They only had to make. Everybody had to make sure there was somebody at home at all times to watch the house because there was no such thing as a lock, a key in a lock. But in many ways, you find that commoner women, samurai women could make pilgrimages when they got old, and they would go in same-sex groups. Commoner women also went on pilgrimages, but they tended to go farther, I would say, than samurai women would have to stay pretty close to the castle town. Some commoner women traveled all across Japan. So frankly, I mean, except for the fact that a samurai woman has her husband has a guaranteed stipend, small though it might be, and a commoner woman has to work for every cent the family, or she and her husband have to work. She had a lot more variety and flexibility in how she lived her life, is what I would say.
Thank you very much. There's another question here that I think it's worth addressing, and I'll speak to it first and then ask for your thoughts. What exactly makes someone a samurai? And this, when we say samurai women, what does it mean? And this is fundamental to the exhibition itself. So it's worth explaining, and I'll do it quickly, that samurai doesn't mean warrior. It's a term that we're using in the exhibition as a catch-all for many things across many centuries. It's not a word that's even used in Japan much historically. There are other terms such as musha or tsuwamono mononofu for warrior. And then Professor Walthall has been talking primarily about the Tokugawa period when there were the terms bushi or buke. We're talking about samurai as a class primarily here. So half of that class is women, and that's what we're focusing on, that social history within that class. But if you, Professor Walthall, have any thoughts to add to that?
Well, this is a status system. The Tokugawa regime tried to keep everybody in their place to the extent that they could. And so samurai is really a function of your status. It's somebody who has access to weapons, and it's somebody who has a public role serving the lord or the shogun, whereas a commoner, and there are various ranks of commoners. You could be a townsman, a farmer, or an artisan, or various kinds of outcasts. They have no official political role. They sometimes are granted permission to have weapons, but for the most part, they are not supposed to carry weapons at all. This is a way to preserve the peace. You don't want armed ruffians out in the countryside. You get them, but you're not supposed to have them that way. And so it's a marker of status. And so you can have a wealthy townsman or a wealthy farmer who has a much easier life than some poor samurai. But the samurai, he has certain clothing that he wears. And he carries two swords. He always carries two swords. And officially, only the samurai do that. So it's a status symbol, not a class issue. It's not an issue of an economic class.
Thank you. A question here for Professor Frühstück about the postcards. They looked a surprising lot like postcards and caricatures from Britain, likewise criticizing the new woman. To what extent are Western attitudes and perspectives on appropriate gender roles influencing the early 20th century equation of womanhood with wifehood and motherhood? And what role do Western colonialist relations and the Orientalist gaze play in the modern conceptualization of the idea of the samurai woman?
Thank you. A very interesting and huge question. So to some degree, of course, the new women of early 20th century Japan were in conversation with new women in other parts of the world, including Britain, including France, including other kinds of places, as they were also with new women, Japanese or otherwise, in Japan, throughout Japan's empire. So one of the interesting things about these new women was that they had various positions on Japanese imperialism. Their early feminism or their intense interest in women's rights and sexual and gender equality did not necessarily go hand in hand with anti-imperialism at all. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. For the metropole, for urban areas in general in Japan, to wear Western clothes, to wear Western hairstyles, to switch to styling elements very different from those that Anne had described about samurai, were of course all contentious and contested signals of modern womanhood. But I think it's not correct to say this was all an import from the West and the Japanese did it too, right? These were phenomena that emerged in different kinds of places and then often signals towards a Western aesthetic, a modern new women aesthetic in Europe, for instance, were a political strategy to make their points.
Thank you. There's another question here, interesting, about the occlusion perhaps of women. So perhaps for Professor Walthall, why is it that the present day narrative tends to underplay the presence of women in samurai culture? Was this narrative constructed during the modern period? If you could speak to that very briefly.
I think it was constructed by historians of Japan. I used to know end that if you read books on Japanese history, you would assume that the samurai reproduced through cloning, and because that's it's a question of the documents that are most readily available are written by men. Men were interested in the political decisions that were being made or not made, and those were generally, even though they had an impact on women and sometimes women were having an impact on them, it was much more obvious that this was men doing it. I remember there was a book on that Conrad Topman wrote about the shogunate, and he had one little line in there about the inner quarters in the shogun's palace, and how Bolito wrote and said, why do you even bother with that? You know, so it was very much, you know, historians, at least for, I think historians in Japan and in the United States, it was a male world. And it's not until the last few decades that women historians have started saying, hey, wait a minute, you know, women did have a role to play, and you can't really understand this society if you don't acknowledge that. I'm sorry, I get upset about this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I've said something similar, that how do they think the samurai reproduced themselves if there weren't women around? But I think it's also to do with popular culture in the post-war period has very much privileged this male warrior figure, idealized that. And we're showing some of that in the exhibition, but we also have the anime of the Ooku, which imagines a shogunate run by women in a futuristic society. So there's a little bit of a balance. I'm sorry we don't have any more time for questions. I'd like to thank both of our presenters this evening for fascinating explorations of both early modern and modern Japanese society and experiences for women. Thank you to the audience for joining us. The Samurai exhibition is open until the 4th of May, so please do come and see it if you can. The next online event in this series is Samurai, the Making of a Global Icon, which will be on the 23rd of April at 5:30. And you can book for that now on our website. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.